What I hate about Satan is that he has this way of getting our eyes off of God, getting our eyes off the blessings of God, and having us focus on him. And then what ends up happening is we begin to go hungry. We begin to notice that our glass is empty. All the while, the table is full. And then he calls us back to be relegated to the back of the room. And that's something that I think happened to a woman in Luke chapter 7. And there's this great picture in Luke of a banquet that happens, and it's this feast that's happening, but the honored guest of the feast is actually Jesus. Jesus was invited to feast at a Pharisee's house, a Pharisee named Simon. Simon was a religious ruler, and so he was seen as this great man on the outside, on the inside. He was close to God, and in order to raise his presence up in the community, he wanted to invite this great man to his house. And he wanted to have this banquet for him to show that we're in this friendship together, and I'm an important person just like he's an important person. So he invites Jesus to his house. And in Luke chapter 7, this is how the story unfolds, starting with verse 36. It says, one of the Pharisees asked him, which is Jesus, asked Jesus to eat with him. And he went into the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. And behold, a woman of the city who was a sinner, when she learned that he was reclining at the table in the Pharisee's house, she brought an alabaster flask of ointment. And standing behind him at his feet, weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears and wiped them with the hair of her head and kissed his feet and anointed them with ointment. Now this is an interesting picture here. This is an interesting feast that's happening. We see this picture of Jesus. He's sitting here at the Pharisee's table. Pharisee Simon, he's preparing this table before him, cooking this meal before him. Jesus and them, I'm assuming they're having some kind of conversation, but in the back of the room, there's this woman who has made her way into the house because these Jewish banquets, they were open for anybody. So even sinful people, it says, this woman who was a sinner of the city, she makes her way into the room because she heard that Jesus was here. But she knows her role. She knows her role isn't to sit at the table with the Pharisee, because the Pharisee looks at her and sees an enemy. So I got to imagine that the Pharisee in his mind is at least thinking, I'm preparing this table for Jesus in the presence of my enemies. Look at that sinful woman. And then you know what the woman begins to do? She creeps over to Jesus' feet and she begins to wash his feet, like was tradition at a banquet. But she doesn't use a towel and a pail of water. So she's crying and her tears are falling onto the feet of Jesus. And then she uses her hair to dry off the feet of Jesus. And you're supposed to give the guest of honor a kiss, but Simon the Pharisee doesn't do that. So this woman begins to kiss his feet. And then she begins to put that oil, that balm on his feet. And as this is happening, the Pharisee sees it. And he begins to think in his mind, and then Jesus, it says in this passage, that Jesus actually hears what he's thinking. And he begins to think to himself, if Jesus only knew who this woman was and what this woman would do, he would not let her do that, and he would push her back to the back of the room again. And here's what I think. I think a lot of us, we're in that same position, aren't we? I think some of you are feeling that, where you feel like, man, I want to be near Jesus, but I feel like society has relegated me to the back of the room. Or maybe I even feel like the church or Christians have pushed me to the back of the room because I'm not holy enough to be in the presence of Jesus. Some of you want to be with Jesus, or you want to be in the conversation, but you look at yourself and you're like, I don't know if I'm allowed to. I'm not good enough to be in that conversation. Some of you want to be part of that conversation, but you're like, I'm a sinner and I don't know that I'm allowed to sit at the table with saints. Some of you feel that way because maybe in our area, you're a person of color in a white community and you feel like, well, I just don't fit in the way I look, or maybe I don't dress the right way, or I don't talk the right way, I don't think the right way, and so I'm relegated to the back of the room. And Jesus is going to keep his eyes fixed on the holy people, but there's no way he's ever going to notice me. I love what happens next in Luke chapter 7. It says this in verse 44. It says, then turning toward the woman. Now, that's an important picture to grasp in your mind, okay? Grab this picture. Jesus is sitting at the table with Simon the Pharisee. He's having this conversation. Simon is thinking that this woman is an enemy of his, that she's evil, she's sinful. Jesus hears him thinking that. And so what Jesus does is he turns toward the woman. He essentially turns the table of the banquet. No longer focuses on Pharisee, on the Simon, on the religious leader. No longer focuses on the food that he's offering to Jesus. And Jesus turns the table and begins to prepare a table before her in the presence of her enemies. He turns the table and it goes on and it says this. It says, then turning toward the woman, he said to Simon, do you see this woman? Now get that picture in your head. Jesus is looking at this woman, looking at her face. He's turned the table, he's looking at the woman, and he begins to talk to Simon, who's now relegated to the back of the room, who now is the enemy of this woman. He says, Simon, do you see this woman? You know what Jesus is doing? He's centering this woman in her experience. He's saying it's no longer about your experience. It's no longer about what you have to offer me. Let's for a moment talk about who she is. And you see her as an empty glass, as a sinner, but she has done some incredible things. And he goes on to explain them. He says, I entered your house and you gave me no water for my feet, but she has wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but from the time I came in, she has not ceased to kiss my feet. You did not anoint my head with oil, but she has anointed my feet with ointment. Therefore, I tell you, her sins, which are many, her debts, that empty glass that you're seeing, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. But he who is forgiven little loves little. And then Jesus, he, looking to her eyes, speaks these words to her. It says, and he said to her, your sins are forgiven. And I don't know about you, but whenever I read this passage and I get that image of Jesus looking at her, she's this empty vessel, and he has this banquet that he prepares before her. And then he's speaking, and as he's speaking, he's just feeding her, and he's filling up her glass. Psalm 23:5 says, you prepare a table before me. And now I think this is the woman speaking. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, and my cup overflows.